Welcome to the You Are Not So Smart podcast, episode 62. For people who may have never heard of it before, what is sort of give us a tour of what naive realism is, its definition and how it works and how we see it every day.
Well, naive realism is the conviction that we see the world in an objective, essentially unmediated way. That is to say that there's a one-to-one relationship between our experience of the world and what the world really is. Because of that, we expect other reasonable people to agree with us, to share our view, and we think that if they don't share our view, the thing to be understood and explained is what it is about them that's making them not see the world the way it really is, or in other words, the way we see it. And in different contexts, we come up with different explanations. Sometimes we think they're ignorant, so they need education in our instruction to see things correctly. Sometimes we think they're biased by self-interest. They can't afford to understand how the world really is. Sometimes we may see it as a product of their culture, or their education, or their youth, or their senility, or whatever. But what continues to be the case is that we believe that we are uniquely objective. We may even realize that we change our views sometimes, but when we realize we've changed our views, we have the conviction that we used to see things inaccurately, non-objectively, and now we've arrived at the point where we see things objectively and wisely.
And it's similar to, the idea that we were talking about earlier, where you're on the road and the person going fast is too fast, the person going slower than you is too slow. In your sort of understanding of your own perception of reality, you start to see that people who see the world differently are not that they see it differently, that they just see it incorrectly. And
right.
this
non-objectively,
right? But you have a perfect objective understanding of everything, and it's why is it so hard to see that in yourself, but so easy to see that in other people?
Well, my former student, who's now a professor at Princeton, Emily Pronin, refers to the biased blind spot, which is a metaphor I like, that when you're looking out at the world, almost all objects register on your retina, except for the ones at this one blind spot, namely where the optic nerve is. But in this case, the blind spot in your perception of the world is with regard to yourself. And I think that's a perfect metaphor. Let me say that this tendency to think that you see things objectively most of the time is harmless or even helpful. We wouldn't want to go through life constantly contemplating what is the nature of matter and energy and all that stuff. The world is as it's given with objects that we relate to. When you and I talk about an oak tree, we agree about what an oak tree is. The problem is that a lot of the constructs that you and I respond to are more ambiguous, are more socially and culturally constructed. So we may agree on what an oak tree is, and the fact that we each think we're seeing an oak tree as it really is not only harmless, it's constructive. We know what to do with it. But when you and I talk about a bigot, we may have very different notions of what a bigot is. But it feels to us like labeling a bigot as a bigot is the same as labeling an oak tree as an oak tree, when of course it's very different. One depended a great deal more on the particular unique experiences we have as a human being in the world rather than the shared perceptual apparatus that almost all of us have when we perceive the world.
Mm-hmm. See, one of the things that really sticks out to me in naive realism is that when you're unaware that you're doing this, you start to think, when you get into an argument with someone, one of the knee-jerk reactions, I've done this, I've seen other people do this, I see this all the time, especially on social media, is since you believe that your opinions and your perceptions and your ideas and your beliefs and your ideology and all that stuff came to you after some sort of careful contemplation, and that you see the world as it really is, and therefore you're making an accurate estimation of how it works. Since you believe that, you think that when someone disagrees with you, the way that you see them as broken and they can be fixed, and the way you fix them is simply put the same facts that you've seen in front of them and have them look at them, and they will. There's no other way. If you could just crack open their head and pour a bucket of facts in there, and oftentimes people do this by just Googling a bunch of stuff and then copy pasting the links right over into the person's feed or whatever, into the email, then the assumption is that as long as they're a reasonable and intelligent and rational person, they'll look at those facts and they will magically become completely in line with your estimation of how things work. Right. And why? What is the big failure in that? Well,
let me give you a real world example. I do a fair amount of conflict resolution work, promoting dialogue between groups in conflict in Northern Ireland and in the Middle East with Israelis and Palestinians. And well-meaning people in these situations are actually quite interested in meeting with the other side. Obviously, the hardliners and the extremists aren't, but there's always lots of people who really want to meet with other people. Lots of Israelis who want to meet with Palestinians and vice versa. And why do they want to meet? Because they want to explain to the other side how things really are. Let me tell you, and they think that if they do that, the other person will become easier to deal with in future. And if not, it proves that they're not objective, that they're not reasonable, that they're not a partner. What I have never experienced in 40 years of doing this is people who say, I really want to meet with the other side because I think I have things wrong. I think I don't know the facts. I think my reasoning is askew. I think I'm biased. And I want to meet with the other side so that they can set me straight. I've never, ever had the experience of even a single individual tell me that.
Wow.
They may say, I want to know how they think so I can empathize or appreciate, but they never think that the purpose of meeting with the other side is to have a more rational view. They sometimes think that when they know all the facts that the other side have, their own view might change, but they think that the way it'll change will always still leave them being objective and reasonable. And if the other person at that point agrees with them, then the other person's reasonable. If at that point the other party doesn't agree with them, well, it's a sign that the other party is seeing the world through the lens of their self-interest or their cultural history. Again, that is something about them. So the point about naive realism is particularly important when we examine political differences and conflict between individuals and groups. In America, we might say between the red staters and the blue staters. In the Middle East, of course, it's between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Let me tell you a great Abe Lincoln quote that we had in the book. Lincoln famously said, I don't like that man. I'm going to try to get to know him better.
That's great. It's This is all such great stuff, and I have to let you go. I know, but if before you go, what and I forgot to ask this, but what, if anything, can we do to, as individuals or as a society, to mitigate sort of the negative effects that come around because of our innate naive realism?
Well, I think you, as a starting point, it's very helpful to just be exposed to cases where people were able to step outside it. We gave one example in the book that I liked a lot, which was the speech that Frederick Douglass gave at the time a monument to Abraham Lincoln was being dedicated. And Douglass, and I'll paraphrase because I don't have the quote in front of me, but Douglass essentially said, viewed from genuine abolitionist ground, namely as an abolitionist and a political activist, said Mr. President Lincoln was inconstant, slow, hesitant, et cetera, describing it that way. And then he goes on and says, but given the political forces he had to deal with, and given his own background, it's hard to imagine him doing otherwise. And he concludes by saying, history or providence, viewed from that viewpoint, viewed through the eyes of history and providence, Lincoln was swift and sure, and we could not have been sent a better president to bring about the changes he brought about. So that capacity to say, here's how I see the world, but let me tell you the ways in which I can best appreciate the way the other person sees the world. That exercise is always a useful one. We often use metaphors, walk in the other's shoes, wear their glasses. I don't like those what I call footwear and eyeglass metaphors, because I don't think they work. The whole point about naive realism is we can't do that. But what we can do is recognize the authenticity of the other person, that they are behaving in accord with their own values, that are authentic, that in many ways, despite the disagreements we might have about policy, if we spend some time talking to them, we might uncover really important agreements about what they want the world to look like. In Ireland, when I've done dialogue work, if we have unionists and nationalists, and we ask them what policies would they like to see in future, of course they disagree vehemently. When we say to them, what would you like your community to look like? They become really quite similar in what they want their communities to look like. When we ask them, what do you want life to be like for you and your family? Then there's no difference between them. And so exercises that allow you to identify ways in which, notwithstanding your disagreements, you share fundamental values. That is a terrifically valuable experience to have.